high above the clouds, where the world below seemed no more than a dream. Hercule Poirot found himself aboard a transatlantic flight bound for New York. It was meant to be a journey of comfort and quiet reflection, far removed from the intrigues of crime and deceit. Yet, as Poirot often reminded himself, evil has a way of travelling in unexpected company. Among the passengers were a wealthy industrialist with too many enemies, a celebrated actress guarding a scandalous secret, a doctor whose past refused to stay buried, and a young soldier carrying old resentments. At 40,000 feet, enclosed in a pressurized cabin, no one could come or go. Every smile concealed suspicion, and every glance hinted at hidden truths. When death struck suddenly, panic took hold, but for Poirot, the hunt had only just begun. For even in the sky, murder leaves footprints. Chapter 1. The flight begins. Hercule Poirot stood at the base of the gleaming aircraft, his small but immaculate figure framed against the bustle of the busy terminal. The plane, one of the newest marvels of transatlantic travel, was bound for New York, and as he mounted the steps to the cabin, Poirot reflected that modernity had its advantages. Only a few decades earlier, such a voyage would have required days of tossing about on the Atlantic. Now, thanks to the miracles of engineering, one could rise into the heavens in the morning and descend upon another continent by nightfall. It was, as Poirot mused, both a marvel and, if fate were unkind, a potential trap. Inside the cabin, the air was filled with that peculiar mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation that clung to long-haul flights. The stewardess, a slim young woman with kind eyes but a strained expression, directed passengers to their seats with professional precision. Poirot allowed her a gracious smile as she guided him to his chair, situated with a clear view of the aisle. Always, he preferred to observe. Always, the little grey cells worked best when fed with small details others missed. Seated beside him, a stout gentleman with a florid face was already fumbling with his seatbelt. Poirot recognized the type at once: prosperous, self-satisfied, and yet, if one looked closely, shadowed by the weariness of a man who fought too many battles in the ballroom. This was Mr. Charles Winthrop, a financier whose reputation for ruthless takeovers had made headlines even in Europe. Poirot had read his name in the papers not long ago, linked to a scandal over crushed competitors. Monsieur Winthrop, it seemed, was a man who made enemies easily. Across the aisle, framed like a portrait in the soft lamplight of the cabin, sat Madame Celeste Duval, a French actress of some renown. Her dark hair was arranged with exquisite precision, her lips curved in a smile that seemed rehearsed. To the casual eye, she was the very embodiment of glamour. To Poirot's more discerning gaze, however, there was tension beneath the surface, the faint tremor of her hand as she lifted her magazine, the glance over her shoulder, as though to ensure no one watched too closely. A woman with secrets, Poirot decided. Further down the row, hunched and self-contained, was Dr. Henry Rathbone. His angular features and thin spectacles lent him an austere air, and his hands, long, bony, and restless, fidgeted with a leather medical bag. There was nothing outwardly amiss, yet Poirot noticed that Rathbone avoided the eyes of those around him, a man accustomed to scrutiny, and uncomfortable beneath it, that often suggested a past he would rather leave behind. Behind the doctor sat Lieutenant James Fletcher, a young man in military uniform, his jaw set with the rigidity of discipline. He was polite to the stewardess, even charming in his way, but Poirot marked the bitterness in his gaze whenever it drifted toward Mr. Winthrop. Here was no random animosity, it was the simmering hatred of history. Poirot tucked away the observation, as he always did, not yet knowing what weight it might carry. The last figure of note, at least in that first sweep of the cabin, was the stewardess herself, Miss Evelyn Harper. She moved about with brisk efficiency, yet Poirot noted that her smile never quite reached her eyes. There was nervousness there, yes, but more than that, a wariness, as if she bore some private burden even as she poured drinks and tucked away coats. Poirot had, through long experience, learned that servants often saw and knew far more than they let on. He resolved to watch her carefully, The plane shuddered as engines roared to life, and passengers settled with varying degrees of comfort. Poirot, who prided himself on a calm stomach, folded his hands neatly on his lap. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the rise of the machine it lifted from the earth. The sensation of detachment, of leaving behind the noise of the world, was to him both exhilarating and faintly sinister. In the air, one was cut off. There was no escape, no outside interference. If something were to happen, if, say, a crime were committed, then all were trapped in the same silver prison until the ground once more welcomed them. And perhaps that was why Poirot felt the faintest prickle at the back of his neck. For though he had boarded this flight with no intention beyond reaching New York for a modest engagement, experience had taught him that crime was no respecter of circumstance. Where men and women gathered, where passions and secrets brewed, there also did the shadow of murder linger. Mr. Winthrop had already summoned the stewardess twice, once for a glass of champagne, once to complain about the chill in the cabin. His manner was brusque, his gratitude non-existent. Lieutenant Fletcher watched him with thinly veiled disdain. Celeste Duval, meanwhile, adjusted her scarf and cast nervous glances at the businessman whenever she thought herself unobserved. Dr. Rathbone kept his nose buried in a medical journal, though his eyes flickered often to the leather case at his side. Miss Harper, Poirot noted, seemed especially harried whenever she approached Winthrop's seat. The tableau was set, Poirot thought, a collection of characters, each carrying their own burdens, their own grievances. To the ordinary passenger, it was no more than the randomness of travel. To Poirot, it had the air of a stage before the curtain rises, actors in position, tension humming in the air, the audience waiting for the first line to be spoken. The great detective adjusted his cuffs and allowed himself a small smile. He had no wish for drama, no desire for intrigue. Yet he knew, with the unerring instinct of long years, that this flight would not be as uneventful as its passengers hoped, for somewhere among them stirred trouble that would soon show its hand. And so, at 40,000 feet, with the world receding far below, Hercule Poirot's newest case began. Chapter 2. A curious encounter. Hum of the engines filled the cabin with a steady vibration, a background music to the quiet rituals of travel. Some passengers busied themselves with newspapers, others with books, or the mindless flick of cards. To Hercule Poirot, it was not the reading or the games that interested him, but the people, their gestures, their voices, their silences. One could learn more of human character in a half-hour's observation than in a dozen formal interviews. Poirot leaned back in his seat, his sharp eyes half closed as though dozing. In reality, he missed nothing. The businessman's disdainmer. Charles Winthrop had finished his champagne and was pressing the stewardess for another. His tone was sharp, impatient, and Poirot noted the faint stiffening of Miss Harper's shoulders as she bent to serve him. Winthrop had the air of a man used to being obeyed instantly, and one who cared little for the comfort of those obliged to serve. When Miss Harper departed, Winthrop muttered audibly, "These flights cost a fortune, and still one must beg for the simplest things." The words were careless, but Poirot caught the flash of something in Lieutenant Fletcher's eyes. Disgust, certainly, but also something darker, more personal. Curious, Poirot thought. He filed it away with the tidy precision of a man arranging a box of clues. A glimpse behind the maskless Duval had not spoken much, though her presence filled the cabin as surely as perfume. She turned pages of her glossy magazine with studied disinterest, but every so often her gaze flickered first to Winthrop, then to Dr. Rathbone, then away again. It was furtive, almost fearful. Poirot, watching, inclined his head politely when her eyes met his. She smiled, a charming, dazzling smile, but Poirot's little grey cells whispered, "This woman is acting a role." The tremor in her hand, the darting glance, the way her lips pressed tight after the smile faded all betrayed nerves. Madame Duval, it seemed, was not merely a lady of glamour. She was a lady under strain. The doctors uneased. Henry Rathbone sat stiffly in his seat, the medical journal open but unread. His long fingers tapped restlessly on the armrest. and now and then he drew the leather case closer to his knees, as though fearing some unseen thief might snatch it away. At one moment, he caught Poirot's gaze upon him. Their eyes met, and the doctor flushed slightly, lowering his head to the pages before him. Guilt, shame, or merely irritation at being observed? Poirot could not yet say, but he marked the detail carefully. A man with nothing to hide meets the gaze directly. A soldier's hatred. Young lieutenant had taken to polishing his brass buttons, his jaw clenched as though in perpetual irritation. He muttered something under his breath too low for Poirot to catch, but the direction of his stare was clear. Again, it was Mr. Winthrop who drew his hostility. Poirot leaned slightly forward. "You were perhaps uneasy in the air, mon capitaine?" he asked gently. Fletcher blinked, then offered a tight smile. "Not at all, sir. I've been in the skies before, though on." Anger. Rathbone had hunched lower, as though to vanish. Miss Harper had lingered a second too long nearby, as though unwilling to leave Duval without protection. The drama was still small, but Poirot recognized a prelude. In human affairs, murder seldom sprang like lightning from a clear sky. It built slowly, like thunder gathering on the horizon. Poirot reflexes. The hours passed, and the engines droned on. Poirot arranged the little fragments of behavior in his mind. Winthrop the tyrant, Duval the nervous actress, Rathbone the uneasy doctor, Fletcher the resentful soldier, Harper the strained stewardess. 5 figures, each with secrets, each with shadows. He did not yet know what role they would play. Perhaps nothing would come of it. Perhaps it would all dissolve into the humdrum of travel. And yet Poirot's instincts whispered otherwise, for even at 40,000 feet, far removed from the soil of the earth, human passions burned as fiercely as ever, and where passions burned, murder was never far behind. Chapter 3. Trouble at 40,000 feet. Flight had settled into a rhythm. The soft clink of glasses, the rustle of pages, the occasional cawful blended with the steady hum of engines. Outside, the sky was an endless sea of silver clouds, touched by the glow of the afternoon sun. Inside, however, tensions simmered quietly. Hercule Poirot, reclining with his eyes half shut, was alert to every flicker of expression, every shift of tone. It was shortly after luncheon was served that the peace fractured. The sudden collapsima. Charles Winthrop had consumed his meal with the satisfaction of a man used to indulgence. He grumbled about the wine, snapped at Miss Harper for being slow with his coffee, and dismissed Fletcher's pointed glare with a smirk. Then, as he leaned back in his seat, lifting the cup to his lips, a strange sound escaped him, a half-choke, half-dash gasp. His face contorted, first in confusion, then in pain. The cup slipped from his grasp, crashing onto the tray. For an instant, no one moved. Then his body lurched forward violently, his hands clawing at his throat. A cry rose from Madame Duval. "Mon Dieu!" The stewardess rushed forward, alarmed, as Winthrop slumped sideways, his face ashen, his eyes rolling. Poirot was already on his feet. Calm, precise. He bent over the stricken man. "Steady, everyone. Give him air." His voice cut through the panic, commanding without raising volume. But it was too late. Within moments, Winthrop's body sagged lifeless against the seat. The mighty financier who had once dominated boardrooms across continents was still. Panic in the cabin, gasps and murmurs filled the air. A lady from the rear clutched her pearls and whispered about heart failure. Fletcher rose, his fists clenched, his face pale with something not quite grief. Madame Duval trembled violently, pressing a lace handkerchief to her lips. Dr. Rathbone, after a startled pause, moved forward with professional instinct. "Permit me," he said brusquely, pushing past the stewardess. He checked Winthrop's pulse, then his eyes, and shook his head gravely. "He's gone." The declaration seemed to echo. Miss Harper stood frozen, the tray still clutched in her hands. Poirot's gaze narrowed. He studied the remains of the coffee cup, the faint residue clinging to the porcelain. Then, lifting the businessman's hand delicately, he observed the bluish tinge to the lips, the unnatural rigidity beginning in the fingers. This was not a natural passing. Poirot said softly, His tone was quiet, yet it silenced the entire cabin. "Monsieur Winthrop has been poisoned." The sealed chamber words landed like thunder. Passengers gasped. Some protested. A balding gentleman in the rear declared it impossible. Another muttered that Poirot must be mistaken. But Poirot stood calmly, his eyes sharp. "We are at 40,000 feet. None may leave. None may enter. The murderer, Mesdames et Messieurs, is among us." The stewardess nearly dropped her tray. Madame Duval gave a small cry, clutching at her necklace. Fletcher's jaw tightened until the muscle throbbed. Dr. Rathbone, though outwardly calm, avoided Poirot's eye. Poirot motioned gently for order. "Let us not give way to hysteria. Panic serves no one. We must proceed with method, with reason." His little grey cells, already alert, began their careful dance. The first examination Poirot bent once more over the dead man. With discreet precision, he examined the cup, the spoon, the remains of sugar on the saucer. He sniffed lightly at the rim, detecting, yes, a faint bitter note beneath the coffee. A subtle poison, one easily concealed. He turned to the stewardess. "Mademoiselle Harper, you serve this coffee." Her face drained of colour. "Why, yes, Monsieur Poirot. I poured it myself, from the same pot as the others." "Yes." Her voice trembled. "Several passengers had coffee, but Mr. Winthrop insisted on extra sugar. He took 2 lumps." Poirot's eyes glinted. "Ah, then it is perhaps not the coffee, but the sugar, that carries death." Reaction's announcement provoked another wave of unease. Duval murmured something about fate and crossed herself. Fletcher gave a harsh laugh. "Fitting end for him. Man made half of England suffer perhaps." Someone simply returned the favour. "Lieutenant." Miss Harper protested weakly, but Fletcher shrugged. "Don't pretend anyone's mourning him." "Not really." Poirot's brow lifted. Such bitterness revealed much. Dr. Rathbone, meanwhile, cleared his throat. "If you are correct, Poirot, and I do not doubt your experience, it suggests planning. The poison must have been administered here, on the flight. It could not have been long ago." "Just so," Poirot agreed, "which means our circle of suspects is limited to those present." Poirot asserts control pilot had been notified. A brief message came from the cockpit that no diversion was possible. The plane must continue its course until New York. Poirot received the news with a small nod. "Then we have time, ample time to discover the truth before we land." He rose to address the cabin. "Mesdames et Messieurs, I beg your patience. Until we arrive, I must ask for your cooperation. Remain calm, remain seated, and answer what questions I may put. The murderer is clever, but Hercule Poirot is here. He will not escape." The stewardess looked at him with gratitude, as though his certainty lent her courage. Madame Duval seemed shaken, her beauty dimmed by fear. Fletcher smouldered with barely controlled emotion. Rathbone busied himself with closing his medical bag, but his hands trembled slightly. Poirot saw it all. Each movement, each flicker of expression, was another thread in the tapestry. Poirot's private thoughts returning to his seat. Poirot folded his hands. Already, the little grey cells were arranging the facts. A man dies suddenly after drinking coffee sweetened with sugar. The poison was subtle, concealed. The opportunity, available to many. The motive, that was the key. Mr. Winthrop was not beloved. He was feared, envied, hated. Such men breed enemies wherever they go. The question was, which of these enemies had acted, and how had they done so beneath the watchful eyes of their fellow passengers? Poirot's gaze drifted to each face in turn. Duval, Rathbone, Fletcher, Harper. Each seemed burdened by something. Each could be guilty. Poirot allowed himself a faint smile. The stage was set, the crime committed. Now, at 40,000 feet, he would unravel the truth. Chapter 4. Locked room in the skied cabin was quieter now, though not with calm, rather with the subdued hush of dread. Mr. Winthrop's body had been discreetly covered and secured, the stewardess following Poirot's instructions with trembling hands. Yet even under the white blanket, the outline of death lay heavily upon the air. The passengers spoke in whispers, darting glances at one another as though expecting guilt to declare itself openly. But Poirot knew better. Murderers seldom confessed in whispers. They hid behind them. Poirot takes command. Poirot rose to his feet, buttoning his jacket neatly. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his voice carrying with quiet authority. We find ourselves in an unusual situation. We are 40,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, enclosed together in this splendid machine of modern travel. None may enter, none may leave. This is, as you say in English, a locked room, and within it, a murder has been committed. A ripple went through the cabin. The stewardess clasped her hands tightly. Madame Duval stifled a sob, and Fletcher muttered something under his breath that sounded like approval rather than fear. Poirot lifted a hand for silence. It falls to me, Hercule Poirot, to see that justice is done before we land in New York. I shall ask questions. I shall make observations, and with the aid of my little grey cells, the truth will emerge. But I warn you, do not attempt to deceive me. The murderer may think himself clever, but Poirot is cleverer still. Securing the evidence, he bent to the coffee cup and saucer, now carefully set aside on a tray. The poison was likely in the sugar lumps, Poirot said aloud, more to himself than the passengers. But how was it administered? That we must learn. He asked Miss Harper. Mademoiselle, were the sugar cubes kept in a common bowl? She nodded nervously. Yes, Monsieur Poirot. On a tray in the galley. Passengers often help themselves. Poirot tapped a finger against his lip. Then it is possible indeed, easy, that a poisoned lump was slipped among the others. The murderer relied upon chance, that Winthrop himself would take it, or perhaps they knew his preference for 2 sugars. Eh bien, it is most interesting. Miss Harper paled. I only served what he asked for. I swear I didn't notice anything unusual. Poirot inclined his head gently. Courage, mademoiselle. I do not accuse. I only observe. First round of questions. Poirot turned to Lieutenant Fletcher. Monsieur le Lieutenant, you sat not far from Mr. Winthrop. Did you observe anything of interest? Fletcher's jaw tightened. Only that he was his usual arrogant self, complaining, insulting, treating the stewardess like a servant. I won't pretend I like the man, but I didn't poison him, if that's what you're asking. Poirot's mustaches twitched. You speak with great bitterness. Did you know Mr. Winthrop before this flight? The lieutenant's eyes flickered. I'd seen him once or twice, enough to know what kind of man he was. He folded his arms and leaned back, signaling an end to his cooperation. But Poirot had caught the hesitation. There is history there, he thought. Next, Madame Duval. She dabbed her eyes delicately with her lace handkerchief. It is horrible, Monsieur Poirot, to die so suddenly, so cruelly. I cannot believe it. Poirot's eyes sharpened. And yet, Madame, you seemed to glance at him often during the flight. Did you fear him? Her painted lips parted, but for a moment no words came. Fear, no. Only recognition. I thought perhaps I had seen him at a party in Paris. He looked familiar. Poirot said nothing, but stored away the remark. A lie, perhaps, or half of one. The doctor speaks finally. Poirot addressed Dr. Rathbone. Monsieur le Docteur, you examined the body. What is your opinion? Rathbone adjusted his spectacles nervously. The signs are consistent with poison, as you suggested. The lips, the rigidity. I would estimate it was ingested only moments before collapse. But without proper tools, I cannot specify the substance. Poirot tilted his head. Yet you carry a medical bag. You are a man accustomed to such matters. Tell me, do you possess any compounds that could cause such a death? The doctor's face flushed. Certainly not. My bag contains only harmless tonics, disinfectants, and instruments. Nothing resembling a poison. Nevertheless, Poirot murmured, we shall have a look later. For thoroughness, the doctor stiffened, his knuckles whitening on the handle of the bag. Rising tension, the atmosphere in the cabin thickened as Poirot moved among them. Fletcher drummed restless fingers on the armrest. Duval avoided his eyes. Rathbone fidgeted constantly with his spectacles, and Miss Harper, though she tried valiantly to keep her composure, seemed near breaking point. Poirot felt the tension mounting like a storm, pressing against the fuselage. One spark, he thought, and the whole cabin might erupt. He raised his hands soothingly. Patience, my friends. We shall proceed calmly, one by one. I shall hear your accounts, and I shall test them against the evidence. The murderer believes he has concealed his tracks, but already the outline emerges. Poirot reflects, returning to his seat. Poirot allowed himself a moment of thought. The coffee, the sugar, the opportunity. Too many could have done it. Therefore, motive must guide the search. Who had cause to wish Winthrop dead? The lieutenant, with his obvious hostility. Madame Duval, with her nervousness and evasions. Rathbone, with his concealed tension and suspicious bag. Even Miss Harper, whose flinching dread suggested more than mere professional irritation. Each has a secret, Poirot reflected. Each could be guilty. But only one is the murderer. His little grey cells stirred eagerly. Soon, very soon, they would begin to sing. Chapter 5. First clues. Air inside the cabin had changed. What had once been filled with the hum of casual conversation was now taut, expectant, fearful. Each passenger sat more rigidly, more alert, as though the very act of breathing too loudly might draw suspicion. Death hovered in the aisle like a silent fellow traveller, and Hercule Poirot, immaculate and composed, stepped lightly among its shadows. Poirot begins his work. Poirot requested that the stewardess clear away the luncheon trays, but he halted her when she reached Winthrop's seat. Non, mademoiselle. Leave everything as it is. Nothing must be disturbed until I have examined it. Miss Harper nodded quickly, her face pale. She was grateful, Poirot noted, for the order, for something solid to hold on to amidst her nerves. He bent over the small table attached to the dead man's seat. The coffee cup stood there, its rim stained faintly. The saucer still bore to sugar grains, one half melted. Poirot lifted the spoon delicately with his handkerchief. He sniffed. Yes, unmistakable the faint bitterness of poison, sharp beneath the fragrance of coffee. The sugar bowl. Where is the sugar kept, mademoiselle? Poirot asked without looking up. In the galley, Miss Harper replied. There's a covered bowl. I brought it to Mr. Winthrop when he asked for extra. He always insisted on sweet drinks. 2 lumps, sometimes 3. Poirot's eyes glinted. Ah, then the killer may have counted on this habit. A poisoned lump placed in the bowl, and voila, fate is left to chance. But if Winthrop was known to take more than one, the odds favoured his doom. He stood, gesturing politely. If you please, mademoiselle, fetch me this bowl. Miss Harper disappeared into the galley and returned with a small porcelain dish containing several neat white cubes. Poirot examined them, turning one over with the tip of his pen. To the eye, they seemed identical. He tapped the lid back in place. We must keep these safe. Later, when science lends her aid, we shall learn more. The cigarette case asterisk. As Poirot straightened, his gaze fell upon something half hidden in the crease of Winthrop's seat. A slim silver cigarette case, engraved with initials not his own. Poirot lifted it carefully, turning it in the light. The letters read. LFE raised a brow. Curious. Unless Mr. Winthrop carried the possessions of strangers, this belongs to another. Fletcher stiffened immediately. It's mine. His voice was clipped, defensive. I must have dropped it. Poirot studied him. Dropped it in your own seat. Yet it is here, beside the dead man. Explain, if you please. Fletcher's jaw tightened. He borrowed a cigarette from me before her meal. That's all. Poirot smiled faintly. So you were on speaking terms after all. I had thought only disdain passed between you. Fletcher scowled, but said no more. Poirot tucked the case into his pocket. We shall not lose sight of this. Madame Duval's whisper. Poirot next approached Madame Duval, who sat pale and trembling. He lowered his voice, so the others would not hear. Madame, you watched Monsieur Winthrop closely before his death. You feared him, did you not? She clutched her handkerchief tighter. Not feared, no. But I knew of him. Years ago, in Paris, he was involved in a matter. Un scandale. A friend of mine suffered greatly because of his greed. When I saw him here, on this plane, I felt only dread. But I swear, Monsieur Poirot, I had nothing to do with this. Her eyes glistened with tears, genuine or otherwise. Poirot inclined his head. We shall see. The doctors bagged her. Rathbone had been watching all this with ill-concealed impatience. At last, Poirot turned to him. "Doctor, you will permit me. We must inspect your bag." The physician hesitated, then reluctantly placed it on the seat. Poirot opened it carefully. Inside were the expected instruments: stethoscope, bandages, antiseptics, small bottles of tonics. Nothing overtly sinister. And yet Poirot picked up a small vial of clear liquid. "What is this?" Rathbone cleared his throat. "Morphine. For emergencies, pain relief. Perfectly legal, perfectly common." Poirot studied the label, then replaced it. "Perhaps, but morphine can be misused, can it not?" The doctor flushed. "Are you accusing me?" Non. I accuse no one yet, but I do not dismiss possibilities." Poirot's tone was calm, but his eyes were keen. Poirot's reflection when the first examination was complete. Poirot returned to his seat and folded his hands. He had collected little pieces: the poisoned sugar, the cigarette case, the nervous glances, the evasive answers. Not proof, but threads of a tapestry beginning to form. Winthrop was not loved, Poirot thought. Each of these people had reason to wish him ill. Fletcher hated him openly. Madame Duval linked him to some scandal. The doctor concealed nervousness. The stewardess trembled at his touch. Motives abound, but which one acted, and how? He considered Fletcher's case, dropped or planted beside the victim. An accident, or an attempt to direct suspicion. Duval's whispered confession of dread, truth, or performance. Rathbone's vial, useful medicine, or weapon. Miss Harper's fear, servant's burden, or something deeper. The little grey cell stirred, restless. Poirot speaks to the cabin. Poirot rose once more, drawing all eyes. "Mesdames et messieurs, I thank you for your cooperation. Already I see patterns. Already I know more than I did before. One among you has killed Charles Winthrop. But rest assured, before this flight touches the ground, I shall reveal who." He paused, letting the silence deepen. "Until then, I advise you, do not attempt to deceive me. The truth, she has a way of slipping through the cracks, like light into a dark room. And Hercule Poirot, he sees everything." A shiver ran through the passengers. Poirot returned to his seat, his eyes half closed once more. But behind the lids, the little grey cells whirred like engines, propelling him closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 6. Suspects Reveilled. Aircraft pressed steadily onward through the vast ocean of sky, its engines droning like the pulse of inevitability. Within the cabin, however, inevitability had already struck. Charles Winthrop, financier and tyrant, lay still under his shroud, and Hercule Poirot, ever fastidious, began to tighten the net. He had gathered scraps of evidence, fragments of truth. Now it was time to ask, who among them carried sufficient hatred, sufficient fear, sufficient desperation to kill? Poirot assembles the passengers at Poirot's request. Miss Harper asked the principal passengers to remain seated in the front rows. The atmosphere was tense, as though the cabin itself had shrunk to a courtroom, each seat a dock of judgment. Poirot stood before them, hands folded neatly, his gaze sweeping from one face to the next. "My friends," he began softly, "murder is never a simple thing. It is like a tapestry, motives woven together, threads of lies crossing one another, until only the patient eye may see the true pattern. Let us, then, examine these threads." Lieutenant Fletcher Poirot turned first to the young officer. "Monsieur le Lieutenant, you were quick to declare your dislike of Mr. Winthrop. That alone is suspicious, n'est-ce pas? You knew him before this flight. I ask you now what passed between you and the late financier." Fletcher's mouth tightened. "It's no secret. My father's company was destroyed by him. Winthrop's takeover left hundreds of men out of work, my father among them. He never recovered. Died a broken man. So yes, Poirot, I hated him. I'd have gladly seen him answer for what he did. But not like this. Not with poison, like some coward." Poirot inclined his head. "Hatred, however justified, is a dangerous companion. One must be cautious, Lieutenant, for sometimes hatred drives the hand to act." Madame Duval Poirot's gaze shifted to the actress. She straightened in her seat, arranging her scarf with trembling fingers. "Madame, you told me you recognized Winthrop from Paris, that you had a friend who suffered at his hands. Be frank, what hold did he have over you?" Duval's dark eyes flickered. "He once threatened me. Years ago, in Monte Carlo, when I was young and foolish. I incurred debts at the gaming tables. Winthrop offered assistance, but in exchange, he demanded favors I would not grant. When I refused, he spread whispers, lies. My reputation nearly ended. I rebuilt my career, but the memory remained. When I saw him here, I feared he might expose me again. I did not kill him, Monsieur Poirot, but I tell you I had reason enough to wish it." Poirot nodded gently. "Reason enough, indeed." Dr. Rathbone exclaimed. The doctor. Rathbone sat stiffly, his medical bag clasped tightly in his lap. "Monsieur le Docteur," Poirot said, "you carry medicines, some of them dangerous. You were uneasy when I inspected your bag. Why? What is it that you conceal?" Rathbone's face reddened. "I conceal nothing. I admit, I feared suspicion would fall upon me merely for possessing chemicals, but I did not administer poison. I am a healer, not a killer." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "And yet, you seemed afraid before ever I mentioned poison. You shrink from scrutiny. Perhaps there is a reason. A case in your past. A scandal." The doctor's voice grew sharp. "I was once accused of malpractice. A patient died unexpectedly under my care. I was acquitted, but the whispers destroyed my practice. Since then, I travel, seeking work where I can. Winthrop, he knew. He mocked me about it. Only this morning, said men like me deserve to be struck off. If anyone believed I killed him, my career would be ended forever. But I did not do it, Poirot. I swear it. Miss Evelyn Harper." Finally, Poirot turned to the stewardess, who stood pale and exhausted beside the aisle. "Mademoiselle Harper, twice I saw you flinch when Winthrop spoke to you. Why?" She hesitated, then lowered her eyes. "He recognized me. Years ago, before I became a stewardess, I worked briefly as a secretary in his offices. He dismissed me without references after I refused his advances. It nearly ruined me. Today, on this flight, he reminded me of it, mocked me. He said if I wished to keep my job, I should show him gratitude. I was afraid, yes, I despised him, but poison, no, Monsieur Poirot, that I could never do." Her voice trembled, yet there was steel beneath it. Poirot's moustaches twitched thoughtfully. Poirot summarized, clasped his hands together, speaking slowly, so the weight of each word sank in. "So Lieutenant Fletcher, whose father was ruined by Winthrop's greed, Madame Duval, whose youth was nearly destroyed by his threats, Dr. Rathbone, humiliated by his scorn, Mademoiselle Harper, once his victim in another way. 4 souls, for motives, each strong enough to kill." He paused, letting the silence press upon them. "And let us not forget any one of you could have slipped a poisoned lump into the sugar bowl. Each had opportunity. Each had reason. The question is, who had the courage to act?" The cabin seemed smaller, the air denser. Fletcher shifted restlessly. Duval's hands fluttered like nervous birds. Rathbone mopped his brow, and Harper stared at the floor. Poirot's private thoughts. Poirot returned to his seat, the picture forming in his mind. So many motives. But murder is not only about motive, it is also about method. The sugar cubes, yes, but the poison itself, where was it obtained? And who had the knowledge to use it unseen? He considered each face. The soldier, bold in hatred; the actress, clever in deception; the doctor, skilled in science; the stewardess, overlooked but ever present. Poirot's eyes closed briefly, his little grey cells murmuring like the engines of the plane. Soon, the lies would unravel. The murderer had left a trace, always, they did, and Hercule Poirot would find it. Chapter 7. The web of leased aircraft flew steadily on through the endless Atlantic sky, but inside the cabin, the atmosphere was anything but steady. Silence clung like a heavy curtain, broken only by the occasional murmur or the clink of a glass. Each passenger sat in their seat, as though in the dock of a courtroom, awaiting judgment, and Hercule Poirot, neat and composed, was both judge and jury. Poirot observed Poirot had seen it many times before. The guilty hide not only behind lies, but also behind truths twisted, reshaped, exaggerated. Fear makes poor liars of men and women. It was time, he thought, to test their stories. He rose and addressed them softly. Mes amis, I will ask again, but with greater care. I warn you, lies, they are like cracks in glass. One sees them most clearly when the light is upon them, and Poirot he is the light. The lieutenant's contradiction. Poirot turned first to Lieutenant Fletcher. You told me earlier that you barely knew Mr. Winthrop, yet you also spoke of your father's ruin at his hands. Which is it, mon lieutenant? A passing acquaintance or long familiarity? Fletcher shifted in his seat. I meant I never met him personally until this flight, but I knew his name. Everyone in my family did. Poirot raised an eyebrow. And yet you lent him a cigarette, conversed with him, allowed him your case. That is not the conduct of a stranger. No. The lieutenant's jaw tightened. He asked. I wasn't going to refuse. But don't twist it, Poirot. I loathe the man. That doesn't make me a murderer. Poirot's mustaches twitched. So quick to anger. Hatred and pride make four clumsy lies. Madame Duval's fabrication next. Poirot approached Madame Duval. Her perfume lingered heavily in the air, masking the faint scent of coffee and fear. Madame, you spoke of Paris and of Monte Carlo, but I made a little inquiry, discreet, before boarding this flight. I know that your name was once associated with a scandal in Nice, not Monte Carlo. You said Monte Carlo to distract, to glamorize, bien. Her eyes widened. What are you suggesting? That you lied, Madame? Lies do not always mean guilt of murder, but they do suggest a secret, and in a murder case, secrets are most dangerous. Duval faltered, then leaned close. Very well. Yes, it was nice. I lied because I feared shame. If it were known, my reputation, my career, it would be ruined. That is all. Poirot inclined his head. Perhaps. But you see how easily a lie may cover something darker. Her lips pressed tight, and she said no more. The doctor's unease. Poirot moved next to Rathbone. Monsieur le Docteur, you claimed your bag held nothing dangerous, yet among your tonics I found morphine. That is dangerous enough. Rathbone flushed. For pain, for emergencies. It is not poison. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Non, not by itself, but with knowledge, a small amount of this, combined with other substances, could kill most efficiently. And you are a man of knowledge. Rathbone's voice grew harsh. Are you accusing me of lying, Poirot? I accuse you of omission. You said your bag contained nothing of harm. That was not true. Why conceal it? Unless you feared its discovery. The doctor's hands trembled on his knees. Because I've lived under suspicion before. I wanted no more of it. Poirot observed him keenly. Fear again. But is it fear of injustice or fear of justice itself? The stewardess's slip finally. Poirot turned to Miss Harper. Mademoiselle, you said you poured coffee for several passengers. And yet, when I examined the trays, only Winthrop had sugar. Did none of the others take it? She hesitated. Not that I recall. Most ask for plain. Perhaps one or two. Poirot's voice sharpened. Which is it, mademoiselle? None or one or two. Precision is everything. Her cheeks flushed. I don't remember exactly. I was flustered. Mr. Winthrop was so demanding. I scarcely noticed the others. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet you remembered clearly that he took to lumps, not one. Convenient, is it not? You recall only what concerns him, and nothing else. Miss Harper's lips parted, but no defense came. Poirot allowed the silence to linger, pressing her into it. A tangled net. Poirot returned to the center aisle, addressing them all. So our tapestry grows more tangled. The lieutenant, who pretends distance but shows familiarity. The actress, who shifts her scandal from Nice to Monte Carlo. The doctor, who hides his medicines. The stewardess, who remembers too precisely in one place and too little in another. Lies, evasions, omissions. All of you, mes amis, are actors upon this stage. He paused, his eyes sharp. And among you sits the murderer. A collective shudder passed through the cabin. Fletcher swore under his breath. Duval clutched her necklace. Rathbone mopped his brow. Harper turned away, biting her lip. Poirot's reflection Poirot returned calmly to his seat, folding his hands. Each lie reveals a motive, but also a strategy. The guilty lie to escape, the innocent, often, to protect themselves from shame. My task is to distinguish one from the other. His gaze fell upon the silver cigarette case in his pocket. It was, he knew, not merely a trinket. Its presence at the scene was deliberate. Either Fletcher dropped it in truth or someone placed it there to implicate him. Which was it? The little grey cell stirred, restless. The lies were thickening, but with lies came truth. A contradiction here. An inconsistency there soon. The pattern would emerge. Chapter 8. A fatal mistake. Silver Bird sped on, high above the ocean. But inside its cabin, the air grew heavier by the hour. For passengers sat under Hercule Poirot's scrutiny, each weaving their tales, each concealing parts of the truth. Yet Poirot knew, lies were fragile things. One careless word, one contradiction, and the murderer would betray themselves. Poirot watched his Poirot sat very still, his fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded. To the casual observer, he might have seemed at rest, but in truth, his little grey cells whirred, like the propellers outside, tirelessly, relentlessly. He replayed every word spoken, every gesture, every glance. The murderer has been clever, he thought. But cleverness always falters. Pride, fear, or carelessness, these are the cracks where truth emerges. Fletcher's rash words silence broke when Lieutenant Fletcher muttered angrily, "Good riddance to him. The world's better off without Charles Winthrop." Poirot opened one eye. "So sure of that, mon lieutenant? You speak almost as though you had awaited it." Fletcher flushed. "That's not what I meant, only that, if someone were to suffer, it may as well be him." Poirot leaned forward. "You say suffer. Yes, I do not recall telling you how he died. I said only poison. How curious that you should speak of suffering, as though you had witnessed his pain before the others." Fletcher stiffened, his jaw clenched. "We all saw him. He choked, didn't he? Twisted about. Anyone could see he was suffering." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, or perhaps you noticed more than you should because you knew what he had taken." The lieutenant's fists balled. "Careful, Poirot. You're trying to trap me." Poirot merely smiled. "But of course, that is my profession." Madame Duval's careless confession at that moment. Madame Duval interjected with a nervous laugh. "Mon cher Poirot, you make everyone sound guilty. Surely you do not believe a lady would dirty her hands with such an ugly act." Poirot's moustaches twitched. "And yet, Madame, poison is often called the weapon of women. Neat, discreet, easily concealed in a powder box, perhaps." Her eyes widened. "You cannot mean, I have never carried powders, not since." She stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her lips. Poirot leaned in. "Since when, Madame?" Her silence spoke louder than words. Poirot gave a small bow. "Merci. You confirm more by your omission than by speech." The doctor's Mr. Poirot turned next to Rathbone, who had been watching with growing agitation. The doctor spoke hurriedly, almost desperately. "Surely, Poirot, you must see the symptoms don't match morphine. If I were the murderer, I'd have chosen something more efficient. A cardiac toxin, perhaps like digitalis." Poirot's eyes narrowed sharply. "How interesting, doctor, that you suggest digitalis. I did not name it. Yet you leap so quickly to the substance." "Why?" Rathbone faltered. "Professional instinct. Any physician would think of it, perhaps," Poirot murmured. "Or perhaps only the one who knew what was used would think of it so readily." The doctor's face reddened, sweat glistening on his brow. Miss Harper's fatal slip. It was Miss Harper, however, who made the gravest error. In her anxious desire to defend herself, she blurted out what she ought not. "I couldn't have poisoned him. I never even touched his cup after I set it down." The words fell into silence. Poirot's head tilted. "Oh, but mademoiselle, I never said the cup was tampered with after it was served." "How did you know that was the suspicion?" Her lips parted, stricken. I only assumed. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Nong, you revealed knowledge. Knowledge that betrays you. For the innocent do not defend against accusations never made. Miss Harper's hands trembled so violently, she nearly dropped the tray she still held. Poirot reflects Poirot sat back, the glimmer of triumph in his eyes. For suspects, for lies, for mistakes, Fletcher's words suffer. Duval's powder, Rathbone's digitalis, Harper's slip, each had betrayed themselves in a moment of weakness. But which mistake was the fatal one? Which slip revealed not merely guilt of lying, but guilt of murder? Poirot's little grey cells stirred with excitement. The pattern was forming. Already, the tapestry began to show its design. He spoke softly, almost to himself. It is always so. The murderer cannot resist. He thinks himself clever, but he speaks too much, reveals too soon. One little phrase and the truth is uncovered. A cabin on Edgeworth passengers sat frozen, each caught in their own web. Fletcher glowered, his fists clenched tight. Duval dabbed at her brow, pale and trembling. Rathbone stared fixedly at his bag, as though it might shield him from suspicion, and Harper stood in silence, her secret trembling on the edge of revelation. Poirot, calm and deliberate, closed his eyes for a moment. Now, I have only to wait. The guilty will falter again, and when they do, Hercule Poirot shall be ready. Chapter 9. The little grey cells at work plane sped ever onward, but inside the cabin time seemed to have slowed, stretched taut like a wire. All eyes were on Hercule Poirot, who sat with the serenity of a man confident in his mastery. His fingers rested lightly together, his moustaches immaculate, his gaze calm yet piercing. The murderer was among them, this he knew. And now, it was time to reveal what his little grey cells had so patiently arranged. Poirot assembles the players. Poirot rose and moved to the front of the cabin. The passengers shifted uneasily, their faces pale under the dim lights. Mes amis, Poirot began. The time has come. A crime most cruel has been committed here at 40,000 feet. Charles Winthrop lies dead by poison. For among you had both opportunity and motive. Each of you has lied. Each of you has made mistakes, but only one among you is the murderer. He allowed the words to hang in the air, then gestured toward the shrouded body. Consider, first, the method. Monsieur Winthrop drank coffee, sweetened with 2 lumps of sugar. Within minutes, he convulsed and died. The poison was not in the coffee, 4 others drank it safely. It was not in the cup, for it was clean before service. Non, mes amis, it was in the sugar. The puzzle of the sugar. Poirot turned to the stewardess. Mademoiselle Harper told us that the sugar bowl was kept in the galley, where passengers might help themselves. This gave opportunity to all. But there was more. Monsieur Winthrop was known to demand extra sugar, always 2 lumps. The killer counted on this habit. A poison cube, placed among the harmless, would almost certainly fall into his cup. He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. Yet, this plan required 2 things: access to poison, and knowledge of Winthrop's habit. The suspect's considerate moved his gaze from one to the next. Lieutenant Fletcher, your hatred was plain. You lost your father because of this man's greed. You spoke rashly, too rashly, of his suffering. But you are a soldier, not a poisoner. Rage may drive you to violence, yes, but poison, it is not your weapon. It requires patience, calculation, things not in your nature. Fletcher flushed, but said nothing. Poirot turned to Madame Duval. You, Madame, lied of Monte Carlo when it was nice. You feared exposure, feared scandal. And yes, Winthrop wronged you. Yet your lie was the lie of shame, not of guilt. You conceal your past, but you did not conceal a crime today. Duval sagged with relief, though doubt still lingered in her eyes. Dr. Rathbone, Poirot continued, you had both knowledge and means. You carry dangerous drugs. You feared suspicion, because suspicion has shadowed you before. You even betrayed knowledge of the poison too readily. Yet your fear is of disgrace, not of guilt. You did not kill. The doctor exhaled shakily, his knuckles white against his bag. The stewardess unmasked. Poirot turned last to Miss Harper. She stood rigid, her eyes fixed on the floor. And then, Mademoiselle, there is you. You told us you remembered only Winthrop's coffee, nothing of the others, to precise in one place, to vague in another. You said you never touched his cup after serving it, though no one accused you of doing so. That, mademoiselle, was your fatal slip. Her lips parted, but no words came. Poirot pressed on, his voice soft but implacable. You once worked for Winthrop. You suffered at his hands. Today, he mocked you again, threatened you again. You had motive enough, but more than that you had opportunity. You alone handled the sugar bowl in the galley. It was the simplest thing to slip in a single poison cube before carrying it out. You watched as he took it. You waited, and when he convulsed, you trembled not in shock, but in guilt. The web-complete cabin was utterly still. Fletcher stared in disbelief. Duval gasped softly. Rathbone shook his head. Miss Harper's face crumpled. I didn't mean for it to happen that way. I only wanted him to know what it felt like to be powerless, to suffer as he made me suffer. Her voice broke, the words tumbling from her like stones. I thought, perhaps another passenger might take it, perhaps no one. But when he demanded to lumps, I knew it was fate. Poirot's eyes were grave. Mademoiselle, fate is not an excuse. Murder is murder, whether it is cloaked in revenge or chance, and Hercule Poirot does not permit it to go unpunished. Poirot's closing words folded his hands. You see, mes amis, it is always so. The guilty cannot help themselves. They lie, they contradict, they reveal what they should conceal. A word too much, a detail too precise, et voila. The truth is laid bare. Poirot looked toward the cockpit, where the pilot had been informed of the outcome. When we land in New York, the police will be waiting. Justice will be served. And though we fly high above the earth, there is no escape from truth. The passengers sat in stunned silence. Only the engines roared on, carrying them closer to the ground, closer to justice. Poirot returned calmly to his seat, smoothing his mustaches. His little grey cells were satisfied. Another crime unravelled, another murderer unmasked, and at 40,000 feet, order had been restored once more. Chapter 10. Justice at landing. The long night stretched on. Outside, the great silver bird carved its way across the ocean, stars scattered like diamonds across a velvet sky. Inside, silence reigned. The passengers sat subdued, each lost in thought, each avoiding the eyes of the others, and at the front of the cabin, Hercule Poirot rested, serene, as though the matter were already concluded in his mind, for it was. The arrival hours later, dawn tinged the horizon, pale gold spilling across the clouds. The captain's voice came over the intercom, steady and reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts. The words, so ordinary, carried extraordinary weight for those aboard. For when wheels touched ground, justice would be waiting. Miss Evelyn Harper sat stiff and pale, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Lieutenant Fletcher gazed grimly out the window, his jaw clenched. Madame Duval dabbed at her eyes, her glamour dimmed by fatigue. Dr. Rathbone hunched forward, gripping his bag as though it might anchor him. Each, in their own way, felt the inevitability pressing closer. Poirot's final counsel. Poirot leaned gently toward Miss Harper. Mademoiselle, he said softly, so only she might hear, you chose the weapon of chance. You told yourself it was fate. But fate is never so cruel as human intent. Remember that. When you face justice, speak the truth. Lies will not serve you. Her lips trembled. I only wanted him to suffer as I did. He ruined my life once. I couldn't let him ruin it again. Poirot sighed, his expression both stern and sorrowful. Many people, mademoiselle, suffer at the hands of cruel men, but they do not choose murder. You crossed the line, and now there is no return. Tears welled in her eyes. She nodded faintly, broken. The landing plane dipped lower, the lights of the city glittering below a net of stars. The passengers braced as wheels struck the tarmac with a jolt, and the engines roared, slowing the great machine to a crawl. Relief for some, dread for others. As the aircraft taxied to its gate, uniformed officers waited on the runway, their cars flashing blue. The sight drew gasps from a few passengers. Though none spoke aloud, Poirot rose calmly, adjusting his cuffs. "It is time." The arrest stewardess was escorted first by two policemen who boarded the plane. She did not resist. Her shoulders slumped, her face pale as marble. "Yes," she whispered, "I poisoned him. I hated him. He destroyed me once, and I would not let him again." Her confession, quiet and trembling, hung heavy in the cabin. Some passengers crossed themselves, others turned away. Lieutenant Fletcher muttered darkly, "She only did what half the world wanted to do." But Poirot silenced him with a look. "Monsieur, it is not for us to choose who lives and who dies. Justice belongs to the law, not to private vengeance." The policeman led her gently down the aisle and out into the waiting dawn. The passengers' reactions made Duval have a sigh of relief, though tinged with sorrow. To think, a woman, so young, so gentle, capable of such a thing. Dr. Rathbone shook his head heavily. "It is always those you least suspect." Yet Poirot noted the tremor in his voice, not shock, but recognition of how narrowly suspicion had grazed him. Lieutenant Fletcher, still bitter, turned to Poirot. "She may hang for it, but Winthrop deserved his end. Don't deny it." Poirot's gaze was steady. "Deserve, mon lieutenant, is a dangerous word. Perhaps he was cruel, unjust, even wicked, but true justice comes not from bitterness, but from the law. Do not mistake vengeance for right." The soldier looked away, ashamed, though unwilling to admit it. Poirot's reflection at last. Poirot returned to his seat, smoothing his mustaches thoughtfully. The hum of voices resumed, subdued but steady, as passengers spoke in hushed tones of what they had witnessed. The great cabin, once a theatre of fear, now settled into weary relief. Poirot, however, reflected quietly. "Evil, it is like the air we breathe. It travels with us, by land, by sea, by sky. At 40,000 feet, locked together in a silver box, it revealed itself once more. But wherever evil travels, Hercule Poirot also travels, and he does not permit it to triumph." He allowed himself a small smile. His little grey cells were satisfied. Another crime solved, another murderer unmasked. And though justice must now take its course, he had, at least, brought truth to light the curtain. False passengers disembarked, one by one, blinking into the bright morning sun. Poirot lingered behind, descending last, his small figure immaculate as ever. He carried no baggage but his dignity, no burden but the certainty of his duty fulfilled. At the foot of the steps, he paused, gazing briefly at the city spread out before him. "Ah," he murmured, "New York, a city of energy, of ambition, of danger. Perhaps even here, crime waits for Poirot." And with a faint smile, he stepped onto the tarmac, leaving behind a flight that would forever be remembered as the one where death struck at 40,000 feet and where Hercule Poirot, once again, restored order from chaos. Chapter 11. Reflections in the quiet journey from the airport to the city was brief, but for Hercule Poirot, it was long enough to think. The commotion of the arrest, the flashing lights of police cars, the whispers of passengers giving statements, these were now behind him. At last, he found himself seated in the quiet of a hired motor car, gliding toward his hotel. The world outside was waking. Newspaper boys shouting the morning's headlines, trams rattling along the avenues, shopkeepers lifting their shutters. New York was alive with energy, but Poirot sat in silence, his small hands folded neatly, his eyes distant. The burden of justice thou satisfaction came with the solving of any crime. Poirot could not shake a certain heaviness. Evelyn Harper, the young stewardess, had not been a hardened criminal. She was not like those cold souls who kill for profit or sport. She had been wounded, humiliated, broken by a man's cruelty, and in her bitterness, she had chosen the path of vengeance. Poirot sighed softly. "Always, it is the same," he murmured. "The heart it feels too deeply. It drives the hand to folly, and once the hand has acted, there is no return." He knew she would face trial, and likely prison. Some would pity her, others would condemn, but Poirot only observed. His task was not to feel, but to see clearly, to bring order to chaos. Yet he was human, and in his heart he felt the tragedy of it. A visit from the past arriving at the hotel. Poirot was surprised to find a familiar face awaiting him in the lobby. Inspector Stevens of the New York Police, a man with whom Poirot had once collaborated on a case years before. "My dear Poirot," Stevens greeted him warmly, though his expression was tinged with solemnity. "I've read the captain's report. Seems trouble follows you, wherever you go." Poirot allowed himself a smile. "Non, mon ami. It is not that I seek trouble. It is that trouble. She seeks me." They shared a brief laugh, but soon grew serious again. Over coffee in the hotel lounge, Poirot recounted the details of the crime, the sugar cube, the confession. Stevens listened intently, shaking his head. "She was clever," the inspector admitted. "Almost too clever, if not for your ear for detail. She might have gotten away with it." Poirot lifted a finger. "Ah, but that is always the way. The murderer cannot help himself or herself. They speak one word too much, reveal one truth they ought not. In this case, Mademoiselle Harper, she betrayed her knowledge of the cup, of the sugar. That was her undoing." The human puzzle is the inspector departed. Poirot lingered, gazing out at the busy street. To him, each passerby was a mystery in miniature. A man hurrying with a briefcase, a woman clutching her child's hand, a newsboy whistling as he pedaled his bicycle. Each carried secrets, fears, motives. Each, under the right pressure, might act in ways unthinkable. Murder, Poirot reflected, is not only the act of the knife or the poison. It begins first in the heart, with hatred, with pride, with despair. The act it is only the last step. That, he mused, was why he had never tired of his work. Not because of the crime itself, no. That was sordid, ugly, but because of the puzzle of human nature. To untangle lies, to see beneath masks, to bring light into darkness, this was Poirot's calling. A quiet resolution that evening, Poirot dined alone at a small restaurant near the park. He ordered simply roast chicken, a glass of red wine, and a delicate custard. The waiter, polite but hurried, scarcely noticed him, and Poirot was glad of the anonymity. As he ate, he reflected once more on the flight, the passengers, the confession. Justice had been served, yet the taste was bittersweet. Winthrop had been a cruel man, despised by many. His death brought no grief, only relief. And yet, Poirot thought, the world was poorer for every life taken, even one so unloved. Order restored, he whispered to himself. But at what cost? He finished his meal, straightened his cuffs, and rose. Tomorrow would bring another day, another case perhaps, another puzzle for the little grey cells. For now, he sought only rest. Poirot's last thought back in his hotel room. Poirot stood at the window, looking out at the glittering lights of the city. Somewhere below, lives intertwined, secrets festered, passions brewed. He knew it was only a matter of time before another summons came, another crime to unravel. But tonight, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. "Poirot," he murmured softly to his reflection in the glass, "you have done well. Sleep now. Tomorrow, perhaps, the world will need you again." And with that, the great detective turned away, his figure small but indomitable, a guardian of order in a world ever prone to chaos. Epilogue: The flight from London to New York was spoken of 4 weeks afterward. Newspapers carried the sensational headline, "Murder at 40,000 feet." Passengers, once strangers, became reluctant comrades in a tale they would never forget, each bound by the memory of that long night above the Atlantic. Miss Evelyn Harper, once merely a stewardess, became the central figure of the story, an object of pity, outrage, and fascination in equal measure. Some argued that her act was born of desperation, others that it was cold-blooded revenge. The courts would decide her fate, but the truth, as Poirot knew, was far simpler. She had crossed the line between suffering and vengeance, and in doing so, had sealed her destiny. Lieutenant Fletcher returned to his post. Chastened by Poirot's words on justice, Madame Duval resumed her life on the stage. Her name safe once more, though her pride bore new scars. Dr. Rathbone, shaken, disappeared quietly into anonymity. Each had faced suspicion, and none would forget it. As for Poirot, he moved on as he always did, discreetly, elegantly, his reputation burnished further by yet another triumph. To him, the case was not about the drama or the headlines, but about the simple, inescapable truth. Wherever men and women gathered, passions festered, and where passions festered, crime was never far behind. And so the world turned, and Poirot walked onward, a small figure with a great mind, forever watchful, forever ready,